G'day, this is Chris Savage from RL Ministries in Australia, welcoming you to this session of the book of Ezekiel. I pray that it will be of benefit to you and help you in your Christian growth. Thank you for coming along. We're into session 19 of Ezekiel. We're looking from chapter 26, verse 7 down to 27, verse 25. Now, we're looking at the fall of Tyre. We saw in the first 6 verses of chapter 26 the fall of Tyre. Now we're going to see what's the means of the fall. So here we go. Now Ezekiel now goes on to show us how the fall of Tyre came about in verses 7 to 14, and the means we see here. Here we go. For thus says the Lord Jehovah, behold, I will bring upon Tyre Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, king of kings, from the north, with horses and with chariots and with horsemen and a company and much people. He shall slay with the sword thy daughters in the field, and he shall make forts against thee, and cast up a mound against thee, and raise up the buckler against thee. And he shall set his battering engines against thy walls. With his axes he shall break down thy towers. By reason of the abundance of his horses, their dust shall cover thee. Thy walls shall shake at the noise of the horsemen, and of the wagons, and of the chariots, when he shall enter into thy gates, as men enter into a city wherein is made a breach. With the hoofs of his horses shall he tread down all thy streets. He shall slay the people with the sword, and the pillars of thy strength shall go down to the ground. And they shall make a spoil of thy riches, and make a prey of thy merchandise. And they shall break down thy walls, and destroy the pleasant houses. They shall lay thy stones and thy timber and thy dust in the midst of the waters. And I'll cause the noise of thy songs to cease, and the sound of the harps shall be no more heard. And I'll make thee a bare rock. Thou shalt be a place for the spreading of nets. Thou shalt be built no more. For I, Jehovah, have spoken it, saith the Lord Jehovah. Okay, so here he talks about how the fall of Tyre is going to occur. And Tyre is consistently addressed in the second person here. And we'll notice that there are going to be two separate means of Tyre's destruction. The first means is found in verses 7 to 11, and this is Nebuchadnezzar. But then when we go on in verses 12 to 14, there'll be others whom God will use. So the way in which we can work this out is that there are two distinct types of means. Is this concerning Nebuchadnezzar in verses 7 to 11, Ezekiel uses a singular pronoun, he. But in verses 12 to 14, he uses a plural pronoun, they. And so he's obviously dealing with others beside Nebuchadnezzar. Now, with regard to Tyre itself, it is consistently addressed in the second person in verses 7 to 14. Verse 7 describes the coming of Nebuchadnezzar. Behold, I will bring upon Tyre Nebuchadnezzar. And now concerning him, Ezekiel points out three things. First of all, he is the king of Babylon. He's the king of the capital of Babylonia. Second, he is the king of kings, which means he is ruler over other petty kings or the smaller kings who are now subject to him. And then the third thing he says is that he is going to attack from the north. Now, if you look at the map, Babylonia actually lies to the east of Tyre. And when Nebuchadnezzar attacked that city, he came down from the north. So this expression from the north is dealing with the direction from which the attack came. Now, concerning the Babylonian army, he says it was comprised of four elements. We had chariots, we had horsemen, we had a company. A better translation there would be he had an infantry, and fourth, he had much people. In the first part of verse 8, he describes the coming destruction of Tyre's suburbs. He says, he shall slay with the sword thy daughters in the field. So in verses 1 to 6, Ezekiel prophesied the destruction of the Tyrian suburbs. But now he tells us that it is Nebuchadnezzar who's going to do it. The second part of verse 8 and verse 9, he describes the actual siege of Tyre, and he emphasizes 5 things. First of all, he shall make forts against thee. Second, he's going to cast up a mound against thee. Third, he's going to raise up the buckler against thee. And fourth, he'll set his battering engines against thy walls. Fifth, with his axes, or better, with his swords, he shall break down thy towers. Now, each of these 5 statements emphasizes a siege of the city. He's not trying to starve them out into surrendering. He's actually slowly penetrating their defenses by means of battering rams, just constantly battering away at those walls until finally a breach is made and they can then pour into the city. In verses 8 and 9, they were fulfilled by Nebuchadnezzar's siege of Tyre, which lasted for 13 whole years. 13 years. If nothing else, you have to admire the patience of the Babylonian army. Now, in verses 10 to 11, he goes on to describe the actual destruction of the city by Nebuchadnezzar. And in doing this, Ezekiel makes 6 statements. Let me just find my wife here and make her a co-host. Okay. Now, in verses 10 to 11, the first statement he makes is, by reason of the abundance of his horses, their dust shall cover them. So the emphasis here is clearly on the huge number of cavalry involved, soldiers on horseback. And second, he says, thy walls shall shake at the noise of his horsemen and wagons and chariots. So what that means is that there'll be so many soldiers and so much military equipment, when they move around, the very ground will shake. Third thing he says, he shall enter into thy gates as men enter into a city wherein is made a breach. So this siege was described in verses 8 and 9, which did result in battering ram finally made a breach in the wall, and now Nebuchadnezzar's armies can now enter into Tyre itself. The fourth thing we see is, with the host of his horses shall he tread down all thy streets. So not only the infantry, but the cavalry will also be able to run through the breach that is made in the wall. So it'll be a pretty sizable breach that's made. And fifth, he shall slay thy people with the sword. So once the breach has been made into Tyre and the cavalry and the soldiers enter into the city, there's going to be a massive slaughter of the inhabitants of Tyre. And the sixth thing we see is, the pillars of thy strength shall go down to the ground. So the very things which the Tyrians would have trusted for their security will eventually collapse. Although the 13-year siege would have given them a sense of hope, because you imagine after 13 years of having this siege, you think, well, I can't get through, so we're safe. But not so. Not so. What we see here is that even this, after this 13 years, they finally got through in the 13th year. So in these verses, he has dealt with the first means of the destruction of Tyre by Nebuchadnezzar. Now, moving on into verses 12 to 14, he talks about others. And others, these others are beyond the time of Nebuchadnezzar, whom God is going to use to bring Tyre to an end. And in the Hebrew text, the pronoun now switches from the singular to the plural. And probably this shift probably points back to the nations of verse 3, chapter 26, verse 3, that followed Nebuchadnezzar in attacking Tyre, completing the destruction that he began. Verse 12 describes the destruction by others, and in doing so, Ezekiel now makes 5 statements. First of all, they shall make a spoil of thy riches. So all of the wealth that Tyre had bragged about earlier in the chapter becomes a spoil to others. And second, they'll make a prey of thy merchandise. This is a simple restatement of the first point. Third, they shall break down thy walls, and those walls were the symbol of Tyre's security. So the picture here is that after the city is taken, the walls will be demolished completely. Fourth, they shall destroy thy pleasant houses. So not only will the protecting walls be destroyed, but so will all the wealthy homes within those walls. And fifth, they shall lay thy stones and thy timber and thy dust in the midst of the waters. So all of the rubble of the city is now thrown into the sea, and much of it will be used later on by various conquerors. So in verses 13 to 14, he now describes 2 key results. First of all, in verse 13, a cessation of mirth, an end of mirth. I will cause the noise of thy songs to cease, and the sound of thy harps shall be no more heard. So what he's saying is that all joy will come to an end in Tyre as a result of what has been prophesied. But beyond that, in verse 14, we're given the reason for verse 13 in the second result. The city itself will cease to exist, and that's why the mirth and the songs are heard no more. Now, in describing the cessation of the city, he states four things. First of all, I will make thee a bare rock. So all that will be left will be exposed bedrock and nothing more. Second, thou shalt be a place for the spreading of nets. Instead of people living in Tyre, they'll just come there for the fishing. And third, thou shalt be built no more. Tyre would never be rebuilt again. And the guarantee is fourth, for I, Jehovah, have spoken it. So these then are the means of the destruction of the city of Tyre. Now we go on to read about the lamentation of the princes in verses 15 to 18. Thus says the Lord Jehovah to Tyre, shall not the isles shake at the sound of thy fall, when the wounded groan, when the slaughter is made in the midst of thee? Then all the princes of the sea shall come down from their thrones and lay aside their robes, strip off their broidered garments. They shall clothe themselves with trembling. They shall sit upon the ground and shall tremble every moment and be astonished at thee. They shall take up a lamentation over thee and say to thee, how art thou destroyed, that was inhabited by seafaring men, the renowned city, that was strong in the sea, she and her inhabitants, that caused their terror to be on all that dwell there. Now shall the isles tremble in the day of thy fall. Yea, the isles that are in the sea shall be dismayed at thy departure. So here in verse 15, first of all, we read about the reaction of the Tyrians, is that what you call them? Inhabitants of Tyre, and the Phoenician colonies, when they hear of the destruction of the mother city. Shall not the isles shake at the sound of thy fall, when the wounded groan, when the slaughter is made in the midst? The word isles here refers to the colonies that had been established by Tyre. But now that their founding city is gone, the lifeline to their wealth is also gone, because it was to Tyre that all their goods were transported. And this is how the colonies earn their living. Now they are all shaking in fear of their future as a result of Tyre's destruction. And we read about the reaction of the princes in verse 16. Then all the princes of the sea, these refer to the chief merchants who presided over the colonies. This is something we know from Isaiah 23, verse 8. Isaiah 23, 8. So these princes of the sea are Tyrian merchants who dominated the colonies. They'll come down from their thrones and lay aside their robes. The coming down from the throne and the laying aside of the royal robes was a sign of official mourning. And if you have a look back in Jonah chapter 3, verse 6, Jonah 3, verse 6, we see an example of this, where the king of Nineveh had done a similar thing in order to avoid the destruction of his city, as prophesied by Jonah. Notice, although they're said to sit on thrones, they're not called kings, but rather the princes of the sea. So this was the position of authority they had, from which they are now forced to step down. Furthermore, they shall strip off their broidered garments and clothe themselves with trembling and sit upon the ground and shall tremble every moment and be astonished at thee. So all of these various actions and descriptions are connected with their mourning. They'll be in a state of mourning and making dirges because of the fall of Tyre. In verse 17, we have the specific lamentation which these princes of the sea are going to take up after stepping down from their thrones and after undergoing all these procedures for mourning. They'll take up a lamentation over thee and say unto thee. The Hebrew word which was lamentation is kinah, which means a dirge. So what's this dirge saying? It's saying, how art thou destroyed, that was inhabited by seafaring men, the renowned city that was strong in the sea. So what these princes and merchants are lamenting is the fall of Tyre's great might. It is entirely beyond their comprehension how such a mighty city as Tyre could have possibly fallen all this time, after all this time. Tyre had been a formidable power in the seas, reigning supremely on the eastern Mediterranean shores. Now her fall sent terror rippling through every shore she had touched. With their source of supplies gone, those nations would suffer great economic loss. And in verse 18, we read about the reaction of the colonies again. Now shall the isles tremble in the day of thy fall. Yea, the isles that are in the sea shall be dismayed at thy departure. Yeah, of course, here with the reactions and mourning of their princes, there's consternation throughout all these Phoenician colonies as to what their future is going to be like now that they've lost their vital lifeline. And we see in verses 19 to 21, we see the descent into Sheol. For thus says the Lord Jehovah, when I shall make thee a desolate city like the cities that are not inhabited, when I shall bring up the deep upon thee, and the great waters shall cover thee, then will I bring thee down with them that descend into the pit, the people of old time, and will make thee to dwell in the nether parts of the earth, in the places that are desolate of old, with them that go down to the pit, that thou be not inhabited. And I'll set glory in the land of the living. I'll make thee a terror, and thou shalt no more have any being. Though thou be sought for, yet shall thou never be found again, saith the Lord Jehovah. So after describing the fall of Tyre, the means of that fall, and the lamenting of the Phoenician colonies, Ezekiel now describes the descent of the Tyrenians into Sheol itself. In verse 19, the point is made here that this descent into Sheol or Hades will come at the time of Tyre's destruction. He says, when I shall make thee a desolate city, like the cities which are not inhabited, when I shall bring up the deep upon thee, and the great waters shall cover thee. Now, Ezekiel had said Tyre's fate was like an ocean sweeping over it back in verse 3 of chapter 26. Tyre would drown in the ocean, and all traces of her would be lost. And this same point is now made again in verses 26 to 35 of chapter 27. Now, the time of the Tyrians' descent into Sheol, it's at the time of that final and complete destruction of their city. Now, Dr. Fruchtenbaum would say that verse 19 deals more specifically not with the fall of the city under Nebuchadnezzar, but rather with the fall under the others, which would be under people like Alexander the Great. The fulfillment under him took place after only a 7-month siege compared with Nebuchadnezzar's 13-year siege. Now, the first part of verse 20 describes the descent into Sheol. He makes this clear with 2 very graphic statements. First of all, he says, then I'll bring thee down with them that descend into the pit, to the people of old time. At this point, the Tyrians are going to descend into the place where so many others have descended before. Going down to the pit is a figurative way of expressing death. And pit is synonymous with Sheol, or the grave. And you can have a look at that in Proverbs chapter 1, verse 12, and Isaiah chapter 14, verse 15 and verse 19, and Isaiah 38, 18. Second thing, I'll make thee to dwell in the nether parts of the earth, in the places that are desolate, of old with them that go down to the pit, that thou be not inhabited. So there's going to be a massive amount of slaughter of these Tyrians. Cities do not go into Sheol, but the inhabitants of cities do. And so this is a picture of a whole city descending into Sheol, because so many will be killed at the time of the destruction of Tyre. In the second part of verse 20 and verse 21, he now deals with the results. First up, I will set glory in the land of the living. So what this statement refers to is the establishment of the Messianic kingdom, in contrast with the descent of Tyre into Sheol. I shall set glory, that is, God's presence or God's glory. The contrast drawn is that between the shadow world of the dead and the earth with its living inhabitants, there Jehovah would establish his glory. He would sooner or later manifest his kingdom, while Tyre and its pomp should be no more, belonging only to the past. So on the one hand, Tyre is going to be destroyed. But on the other hand, the kingdom is to be established. And this is in spite of Tyre's boast back in verse 3 that the ultimate glory would belong to her. However, God says that the ultimate glory will belong to Israel. So at the time of Tyre's final descent into Sheol, God intends to set up his messianic kingdom. Now, second, I will make thee a terror. And this will be a terror to those who had put their faith in Tyre, but now see it lost. And the third thing, thou shalt no more have any being. You will simply cease to exist. Fourth, though thou be sought for, yet shall thou never be found again. So the picture here is that once the final destruction of Tyre takes place, it will never be rebuilt again. So that in the kingdom, there'll be no city of Tyre in existence. Now, one thing that's very clear is that after Alexander the Great's destruction of Tyre, the city was rebuilt. In fact, there's a city today called Tyre. It is built along the same site of the ancient coastal and island city of Tyre. So Dr. Fruchtenbaum cannot see how this prophecy could be said to have had its final fulfillment either by Nebuchadnezzar or by Alexander the Great. So this prophecy must therefore have a future fulfillment, and prophetically speaking, Dr. Fruchtenbaum would say that Tyre will have its final and ultimate destruction in the Great Tribulation. And of course, after that period, that is when the kingdom is set up, and that is when the glory will be with Israel and not with Tyre. Now we come to chapter 27, and we see the lamentation over Tyre. Now, Ezekiel does not spend just one chapter on Tyre. He takes up all of chapter 27 and most of chapter 28 to complete his prophecies about that city. In chapter 27, verses 1 to 36, he deals with the lamentation of Tyre, or lamentation over Tyre, and this is subdivided into three smaller units. First up, we see the great ship Tyre, which is in chapter 27, verses 1 to 3. We'll just read the first 4 verses to start with here. The word of Jehovah came again unto me, saying, And thou, son of man, take up a lamentation over Tyre, and say unto Tyre, O thou that dwellest at the entry of the sea, that art the merchant of the peoples unto many isles, thus says the Lord Jehovah, Thou, O Tyre, hast said, I am perfect in beauty. Thy borders are in the heart of the seas. Thy builders have perfected thy beauty. In this passage, the city of Tyre is looked upon as a great ship of state, made to perfection in strength and beauty and seaworthiness. And yet, as we're going to see as we get through the chapter, nevertheless, we're going to see it's going to get sunk. In verse 1, word of Jehovah comes to Ezekiel again, introducing a new prophecy here, but having the same subject as chapter 26. In verse 2, this time, Ezekiel is to take up a lamentation over Tyre. In verses 3 to 4, he describes the commercial position of Tyre, and he mentions 5 things about Tyre. First of all, O thou that dwellest at the entry of the sea. The point of this statement is to show that Tyre was located at a very strategic spot, which made it easily defensible. Second, that the merchant of the peoples of many isles, meaning that Tyre was a center of commerce and economy. The term isles refers to the colonies of Tyre, meaning the Phoenician colonies, among others as well. Tyre was the hub of all of this. It was like the Wall Street of the ancient world. That's where all the commercial business was taking place there in the Mediterranean. Third, thou, O Tyre, have said, I am perfect in beauty. When we get to chapter 28, we're going to see that God says this about Satan. But in this verse, it is Tyre saying this of herself. Now, the same type of description, perfect in beauty, is also used of Jerusalem in Lamentations chapter 2, verse 15. And it shows once again that the desire of Tyre was to take over the preeminence from Jerusalem. Now, the fourth thing we see here is it says, thy borders are in the heart of the seas. So the city proper was an island, especially after the Babylonian destruction. It was rebuilt on an island just off the coast. And fifth, thy builders have perfected thy beauty. Now, the builders were Tyre's leaders, Having made that statement that the leaders were builders, Tyre is now going to be pictured as a ship of state. They have made all thy planks of fir trees from Senir. They have taken a cedar from Lebanon to make a mast for thee. Of the oaks of Bashan have they made thine oars. They have made thy benches of ivory inlaid in boxwood from the isles of Kittim. Of fine linen with broidered work from Egypt was thy sail, that it might be to thee for an ensign. Blue and purple from the isles of Elisha was thine awning. So here in verses 5 to 7, Ezekiel deals with the building of this ship. He takes it apart section by section in order to demonstrate just how well it was built. Concerning its planks in verse 5, they have made all thy planks of fir trees from Senir. Senir was the Amorite name for Mount Hermon, which is the highest mountain in the Holy Land. And this connection of Mount Hermon and Senir you can find in Deuteronomy chapter 3, verse 9. Second, concerning the mast, they have taken a cedar from Lebanon to make a mast for thee. Now, Lebanon was famous for its great cedar trees. And one of these had been used to make a mast for this ship. Third, concerning the oars in verse 6, oaks of Bashan have they made thine oars. Bashan is the area east of the Sea of Galilee, the area now known as the Golan Heights. Oak trees were cut down from there to make oars for this great ship of state, which is Tyre. The fourth thing concerning the benches, or this is the deck of the ship, they have made thy benches of ivory inlaid in boxwood from the isles of Kittim. So working in ivory was a highly developed craft in Tyre. And the origin of the ivory in this case was Kittim, which is Cyprus. Concerning the sail in the first part of verse 7, of the fine linen which with broidered work from Egypt was thy sail. Hebrew word for fine linen here, which is shesh, which was a very fine linen mentioned in Genesis 41, verse 42, Genesis 41, 42, Exodus 26, 36, Exodus 26, and Proverbs 7, verse 16. It came from Egypt, known for its fine linen cloth. And the purpose of this sail was that it might be an ensign for thee. It was to highlight them. Now, concerning the awning at the end of verse 7, blue and purple from the isles of Elisha was thine awning. The purple here was made from a special substance called murex solvus in Latin. It came from the island of Elisha, which is a place in Cyprus, according to Genesis 10:4. And that's where this awning came from. So what's the point of all of this? Well, in these verses, Tyre is pictured as a magnificent ship of state upon which every luxury and great wealth had been lavished by bringing in all these items from all over the ancient world of the Middle East. And having described the ship in verses 8 to 9, Ezekiel now describes the sailors. The inhabitants of Sidon and Arvad were thy rowers. Thy wise men, O Tyre, were in thee, they were thy pilots. The old men of Gebal and the wise men thereof were in thee, thy caulkers. All the ships of the sea with their mariners were in thee to deal in thy merchandise. So a ship's got to have sailors, and these are the actual men here who helped put the ship together and made it seaworthy, and he breaks them down into 4 categories here. First of all, in the first part of verse 8, we have the rowers. Rowers were used especially when there was insufficient wind to fill the sail. In Tyre's case, the inhabitants of Sidon and Arvan were thy rowers, and these were strong men and good at rowing great ships. Second category was the sailors. These are the pilots. It says, thy wise men, O Tyre, were in thee. They were thy pilots. Well, think what a pilot does. The picture here is that the smart ones, the counselors to the king of Tyre, were the pilots who guided this ship of state by deciding when it should go and when it should not. It was through their expert skills that Tyre became as wealthy as it did. Third category were the caulkers. in the first part of verse 9, the old men of Gebal and the wise men thereof were in thee thy caucus. The old men refers to rulers or governors. Now, Gebal was the Lebanese city, which is known today as Byblos. That's its Greek name. Gebal is mentioned in Joshua 13:15, and 1 Kings 5:18. Caulkers were the sailors who repaired the leaks and the fissures which would naturally develop as the ship was worked. So they were just the fix-it guys. Fourth and last category of sailors in Tyre were the mariners. Now, all the ships of sea with their mariners were in thee to deal in thy merchandise. Mariners were the seamen who actually controlled the activities of the ship, and so these guys were involved in the various aspects of amassing wealth for the city of Tyre. In verses 10 to 11, we see the army of Tyre. They had to have an army to defend them. Persia and Lud and Put were in thine army. Thy men of war, they hang the shield and helmet in thee. They set forth thy comeliness. The men of Arvad with thine army were upon thy walls round about, and valorous men were in thy towers. They hang their shields upon thy walls round about. They have perfected thy beauty. So here in verses 10 to 11, we read about the army, which had two different elements within it. The first, in verse 10, were the mercenaries. These were foreign soldiers who were hired to serve in the Tyrian army, and they came from three different areas. Persia and Lud and Put were in thine army. Now, by the way, this is actually the first mention of Persia, because at this time, Persia was only just beginning to rise to power. Lud, which is Lydia, is mentioned in Genesis 10:13, as Ludim. Then Put, which is also found in Genesis 10:6. Now, what is known as Put in the Bible was known to the Egyptians as Punt, P-U-N-T. And this is the area and city known by that name, was on the African coast of the Red Sea. Yeah. Soldiers from these three areas served as mercenaries to Tyre. But we also know that soldiers from Put also served as mercenaries in the Egyptian army from Jeremiah 46, verse 9. Jeremiah 46:9. Oh, it's there on the screen. So it's obvious that the men of Put did enjoy being mercenaries to both the Egyptians and the Tyrians. These were thy men of war, and they hang the shield and helmet in thee. They set forth thy comeliness. So these were the men who helped to maintain the peace of Tyre, and that is the first category of soldiers in Tyre's army, which we see here. These are the mercenaries. Now, the second category talked about in verse 11 were the native guards. The men of Arvad with thine army were upon thy walls round about, and valorous men were in their towers, etc., etc. The native guards were those who were closer to the center of the city. Whereas the mercenaries had the task of protecting the perimeter, the native guards protected the city wall area and the city itself, because they could be best trusted if it ever came to an actual breach of the city's defenses. So in these verses, verses 1 to 11, Ezekiel describes this great ship of state, which is a city of Tyre. It's not a real ship, it's just a city of Tyre. Now, having described the ship in verses 12, having described the ship, now in verses 12 to 25, he now talks about the extension of Tyre's trade. We're just going to read some of it here. We're going to read down to about verse 23. Okay, from 12 to 23. Tarshish was thy merchant by reason of the multitude of all kinds of riches, with silver, iron, tin, and lead. They traded for thy wares. Javan, Tubal, and Meshech, they were thy traffickers. They traded the persons of men and vessels of brass for thy merchandise. They of the house of Togarmah traded for thy wares with horses and war horses and mules. The men of Dedan were thy traffickers. Many isles were the mart of thy hand. They brought thee in exchange horns of ivory and ebony. Syria was thy merchant by reason of the multitude of thy handiworks. They traded for thy wares with emeralds, purple, embroidered work, and fine linen, and coral and rubies. Judah and the land of Israel, they were thy traffickers. They traded for thy merchandise wheat of Minnith, and Panag, and honey, and oil, and balm. Damascus was thy merchant for the multitude of thy handiworks, by reason of the multitude of all kinds of riches, with the wine of Helbon and white wool. Vadan and Javan traded with yarn for thy wares. Bright iron, cassia, and calamus were among thy merchandise. Dedan was thy trafficker in precious cloths for riding. Arabia and all the princes of Kedar, they were the merchants of thy hand, in lambs and rams and goats. In these were they thy merchants. The traffickers of Sheba and Ramah, they were thy traffickers. They traded for thy wares with the chief of all spices, with all precious stones and gold. Right, we'll just leave it there for a sec, or for a few minutes. Now we're going to begin to see how this great ship traveled all over the place in order to trade and to extend its economic holdings. In verse 12, he first deals with Tarshish. Now Tarshish says was thy merchant by reason of the multitude of all kinds of riches. The Tarshish we're talking about here was Tartessus of Spain. Tartessus of Spain. There it is on the screen. Now, it was a Phoenician colony known for its great wealth in silver. It's also found in Jeremiah 10, verse 9. But this Tartessus was also rich in all kinds of metals. Ezekiel mentions four things which Tyre traded in with Tartessus: silver, iron, tin, and lead. They traded for thy wares. So in return for what Tyre had to offer, she received these metals from Tarshish. But the area was especially famous for its silver. In verse 13, Ezekiel mentions three other places. First of all is Javan. It's a Hebrew term for Greeks. It's the Hebrew form for the Ionians, who were Greeks. Then we have Tubal, refers to the Tabali of the Assyrian records, and may well be a reference to the Tabarani found in Northeast Asia and the Black Sea. Meshech, which is the Mushki, also the Assyrian records, or the Moshki of Northeast Asia, also by the Black Sea. In actual fact, this name later became the background name to the city of Moscow. But when we get to chapter 38, we'll have a better look at that. Now, these three nations, Javan or Greece, Tubal, which also gave its name to the city of Tobolsk in Siberia, which we'll get to in chapter 38, and then Meshech traded the persons of men. In other words, these three areas were especially involved in the slave trade. And this is something also pointed out in Joel chapter 3, verse 6, where it says, here he says, they traded the vessels of brass for thy merchandise. So they traded slaves as well as brassware with Tyre. I believe, I think it was, which one was it? Was it Meshech? One of these was especially famed for its brass weaponry. And it's one of those two in the Black Sea. Okay, in verse 14, he turns to Togarmah, which is Armenia, which was famous for its horses and mules. Togarmah traded for thy wares with horses, war horses and mules. Verse 15, we have Dedan. This is possibly not the Dedan in Arabia, because Ezekiel talks about this place later on, but another place called Dedan, which is presently unknown. We simply don't know where this one is. Wherever this Dedan was and what they gave to the city of Tyre in trade had to do with ivory and ebony. Probably refer to the many isles of the Persian Gulf or the Red Sea. That's a possibility. We're not quite sure. In verse 16, he turns his attention to Syria. Syria was thy merchant by reason of the multitude of thy handiworks. They traded for thy wares with emeralds, purple embroidered work, and fine linen, coral and rubies. So according to this verse, Syria was a heavy trader with Tyre. They traded 6 things in particular: emeralds, which could also mean carbuncles, purple embroidered work and fine linen, and coral and rubies. Verse 17, he talks about the trade which Tyre had with the 2 Jewish kingdoms of Judah and the land of Israel. They were thy traffickers. They traded for thy merchandise, wheat of Minnith, and Panag, and honey and oil and balm. Now, Tyre received 5 things from the 2 Jewish kingdoms. First, wheat of Minith, which refers to the wheat which the Jews grew in the area of Ammon, according to Judges 11:33. Second, Judges 11:33. Second, they received from the Jews Panag, which is sweetmeats made with honey and oil and balm. Third is the honey. Fourth, the oil. Fifth, the balm as well. Now, in verse 18, we come to Damascus. Damascus was thy merchant for the multitude of thy handiworks, by reason of the multitude of all kinds of riches, the wine of Helbon and white wool. So Tyre received by trade from Damascus 2 things. First, the wine of Helbon, which was good wine, and Helbon is known as Aleppo today, Aleppo. Secondly, white wool. Damascus traded with Tyre with a multitude of all kinds of riches. Verse 19, we come to 2 other places, Vaidan and Javan. We're not sure where Vaidan was. The context would imply that it was somewhere in Arabia. It's possible that what was then known as Vaidan is modern day Aden. We don't know. As for Javan, this is not the same place as in verse 13, different place. That one back in verse 13 referred to Greece, but this Javan here is in the context of Arabia, in what is known as the Yemen, down in that area. So these 2 places traded with yarn for thy wares. And among the merchandise Tyre received was bright iron, cassia, and calamus. Word used for bright iron could also mean iron from Uzal, with Uzal being a possible place name. They also received cassia, and thirdly, calamus. Calamus was an aromatic cane. In verse 20, we deal with Dedan. Now, this is the Dedan of Arabia, and not the same Dedan as in verse 15. Dedan was a trafficker in precious cloths for riding. So the main thing Tyre received from Dedan in Arabia was precious cloth. In verse 21, we have Arabia and Kedar. Arabia and all the princes of Kedar, they were the merchants of thy hand. Arabia here refers to the main Arabian peninsula, and Kedar is a specific area within that peninsula. And from this area, Tyre received 3 types of livestock: lambs, rams, and goats. In verse 22, he mentions Sheba and Ramah. Both these places were on the Arabian coast of the Persian Gulf. Genesis 10:7, you can find them in Genesis 10:7. It says that they traded for thy wares with the chief of all spices and with all precious stones and with gold. There you go, gold now. So Tyre received all kinds of expensive spices, different types of precious stones, and also one precious metal, which was gold. Then we go across to the traffickers who are in Mesopotamia in verses 23 and 24. We have Haran and Canaan and Eden. The traffickers of Sheba, Ashur, and Chilmad were thy traffickers. These were thy traffickers in choice wares, in wrappings of blue embroidered work, and in chests of rich apparel, bound with cords and made of cedar among thy merchandise. In verses 23 to 24, Ezekiel now deals with Mesopotamia. In verse 23, the Mesopotamian region served as traffickers with Tyre, and 6 places are mentioned. First is Haran, which is over near Syria. Second is Canaan, but where that place then was is unknown. It's possibly Calne, which is an Assyrian city in the Tigris. Not sure. Genesis 10:10 speaks about it, but we're not sure. Some commentators say it is, but Dr. Fruchtenbaum says we're not quite sure where it is. Third is Eden, which is the same as Bit Adini of the Assyrian records, and that was in the era of Babylonia. Fourth, there was Sheba, which was also in Babylonia. And then fifth, we have Ashur, which is the Hebrew form of Assyria. Sixth was Chilmad, and this place is also unknown at the present time. So these 6 centers were the traffickers on behalf of Tyre with the area of Mesopotamia, within the area of Mesopotamia. Now, verse 24 spells out what they traded in, and 4 things are mentioned. So that's all these 6 these 6 areas up there, they traded in these things. Choice wares. First thing, choice wares. It doesn't say what the choice wares are. Second, wrappings of blue. Third, broidered work. Fourth, chests of rich apparel bound with cords and made of cedar. So it would appear to be a lot of material, cloth material and material like that. We see the ships of Tarshish in verse 25. The ships of Tarshish were thy caravans for thy merchandise, and thou wast replenished and made very glorious in the heart of the seas. So we now conclude this section here in verse 25 with these ships of Tarshish, which were thy caravans for thy merchandise. The phrase ships of Tarshish was just actually, it was a technical name for the ships of Tyre. They were just simply large vessels carrying cargo on the open sea. It was Tyre's merchant navy that made it the center of the world economy. So we don't have to necessarily think that these ships came from Tartessus in Spain. Ships of Tarshish was like a company name or a brand name for the ships from Tyre. It was a company line. And in actual fact, it was the ships of Tyre, the ships of Tarshish, the merchant navy, that made Tyre the center of world commerce. And then Ezekiel says, thou wast replenished. In other words, Tyre was made rich because of her ships, but the fact that the expression used here is the same as found in chapter 26, verse 2, shows that the emphasis clearly seems to be that Tyre was made rich at the expense of Judah's fall, which was exactly as she had hoped back in chapter 26, verse 2. Now, although it might look like a wonderful victory of Tyre over Jerusalem, in the long run, as we're going to see, it's going to cause the collapse of Tyre. Thou wast made very glorious in the heart of the seas. So Tyre was already a great commercial center before the fall of Jerusalem, and now with Jerusalem's fall, she became even greater. And that's where we're going to leave it for this session. Okay, thank you for coming along. Study hard and grow strong. We'll see you in the next week.